Good afternoon and welcome to the fourth event of the 2020-2021 Spotlight Series on Polarization and Identity, a joint venture by Northrop Auditorium, the Institute for Advanced Study, and the University Honors Program. I'm Matt Bribitzer-Stull, Director of the University Honors Program, Professor of Music Theory, and Associate Dean for Undergraduate Education. And if you're confused why my Zoom window says John Rash, fear not, our moderator will be joining you shortly. Before that, though, it's my pleasure to be able to open today's event, which is a panel discussion on rural and urban identities and polarization. There are two remaining Spotlight Series events this year, the fifth on March 18th at Thursday at 3:30 p.m. That one will cover religious identity and polarization, and our final event on Thursday, April 15th at 3:30 p.m., which will be a panel discussion among three University of Minnesota faculty members, Catherine Pearson of Political Science, Colin Agger from the School of Journalism, and Bill Doherty from Family Social Science on polarization and identity in America, reflecting on the themes of the entire series this year. Honors students who are joining me for discussion after today's event should proceed to the Nolte Lounge at 5:15 p.m. or join by Zoom with the email link or calendar link that I sent to you. At this point, it's my pleasure to introduce to you all Brianna Menning of the Institute for Advanced Studies. Thank you and enjoy today's event.
Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Brianna Menning, the Programs and Communications Manager with the Institute for Advanced Study. One second. The University of Minnesota Spotlight Series is a collaborative partnership between the IAS, the University Honors Program, and Northrop. This is a six-part series focusing on polarization and identities, inspired both by the recent presidential election and the polarization that has happened in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. In an environment in which conversations across different identities and ideologies are becoming increasingly contentious, we hope to model ways to create meaningful dialogue about these difficult but important topics for our students and our community. We would like to give a land acknowledgement today as well. The University of Minnesota Twin Cities is located on traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous people. The university resides on Dakota land ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. The IAS acknowledges this place has a complex and layered history. This land acknowledgement is one of the ways in which we work to educate the campus and community about this land and our relationships with it and each other. The IAS is committed to ongoing efforts to recognize, support, and advocate for American Indian nations and peoples. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's three panelists. Shannon Smith-Jones serves as the Executive Director of Hope Community, a cutting-edge organization that values housing as a stabilizing force in community and demonstrated the value of community engagement long before it was an established practice in the field. Before joining Hope, Shannon worked at Urban Homeworks, establishing the housing organization's earliest community engagement strategies. She serves on the board of directors of the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, Project for Pride in Living, and formerly served on the board of the Cleveland Neighborhood. She is an adjunct professor on neighborhood revitalization at the University of Minnesota's Center for Urban and Regional Affairs. A lifelong resident of North Minneapolis, Shannon has more than 15 years of experience in community development, affordable housing development, community engagement, and housing justice. With her deep commitment to community voice and asset-based frameworks, she has quickly become a national leader in the anti-displacement field. Next, we will also have Peter Lindstrom joining us. Peter is the manager of public sector and community engagement with the Clean Energy Resource Teams at the University of Minnesota's Regional Sustainable Development Partnerships and Extension. In this role, Peter spearheads outreach and education to local units of government, cities, counties, townships, and school districts about approaches for financing energy efficiency and renewable energy improvements. Peter also represents District 10 on the Metropolitan Council and served as the mayor of Falcon Heights for 10 years. Most recently, Peter was the assistant director of the Center for Science, Technology, and Public Policy and served as the mayor of Falcon Heights, missed my line, at the University of Minnesota Humphrey School, Executive Director of SciMath Min, and the Vice President of Public Affairs at the Minnesota High Tech Association. Peter is also involved with the Roseville Area Schools Foundation, Family Housing Fund, and Northwest Youth and Family Services. Lastly, Elissa Hansen is the President and CEO of Northspan, a nonprofit consulting firm. She leads the organization with more than 20 years of experience in business, community, organizational, and economic development across Minnesota and Wisconsin. She invests her time creatively advancing others' capabilities. She has previous experience with the Area Partnership for Economic Expansion, APEX, the Brainerd Lakes Area Development Corporation, and as a member of the Duluth City Council. She currently serves on the Duluth Mayor's Economic Development Coalition, the Duluth Airport Authority Board, and is an APEX board member. Elissa grew up in central Minnesota, and after living and working across the country, she chose to make Duluth her home. In 2019, Elissa was honored as one of the Duluth News Tribune's 20 Under 40, which celebrates professionals who are making a positive impact and working for change in the region. I will now move on to Zoom instructions. I swear we'll get started with the event soon. If you have questions at any time during today's presentation for our speakers, you can enter them in Zoom through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. To send comments to the panelists or to introduce yourselves to each other, you may do that in the chat section. You will need to select chat all panelists and attendees if you want to chat with the other attendees at today's event. Now I will introduce our moderator for today and for the series, John Rash. John Rash is an editorial writer and columnist with the Star Tribune. His Rash Report column analyzes media and politics, and his focus on foreign policy has taken him on international reporting trips to China, Japan, South Korea, Rwanda, Kazakhstan, Turkey, Lithuania, Kuwait, and Canada. John's commentary can be heard on WCCO AM radio on Friday mornings at 8:10 a.m. and on Wednesdays on Playing Politics, a podcast from the editorial board. He lives in St. Louis Park with his wife, 2 children, and a dog. Thank you, John. Take it away.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the generous introduction and the invitation to take part in the Spotlight series, not just today, but throughout the 6 events, the first 3 of which I found quite compelling, and certainly expect that today's conversation will continue in that tradition. I want to thank the panelists for their time and interest, and all of you for taking the time and interest to hear from them today. You know, among the complex components of polarization and identities, the subject of the Spotlight series, the theme we'll explore today is among the most important. After all, demography is destiny, it is often said. But what if it's not demography, but geography, or a combination of the two, among other factors, in the complicated cultural kaleidoscope leading to an intensification of identities and polarization? The rural-urban divide and all the subdivisions and suburbs and exurbs, literally in its architecture and figuratively in the archetypes citizens sort themselves out culturally, politically, socially, with profound ramifications in shaping a modern American life, was apparent in the election. And well before that, when we literally saw the extraordinarily disproportionate number of flags and signs supporting President Donald Trump in greater Minnesota and western Wisconsin, and the phalanx of lawn signs for now President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris in suburban and urban front yards. And it manifests itself in several other aspects of today's cultural and political debates and divides, some of which I'm sure we'll discuss today, from mask mandates to the protester and police response to the killing of George Floyd. Data suggests that this self-sorting on a geographic basis is intensifying as birds of a feather build more like-minded nests, flocking to neighborhoods that are less economically, culturally, socially, politically diverse than previous decades. So beyond the urban, suburban, exurban, rural divides, the ones between the cities and greater Minnesota, the split is now neighborhood by neighborhood, and sometimes even block by block. What might this mean for Minnesota and the nation? And are there political and cultural touch points that can and perhaps are breaking down these barriers. To explore this, we'll hear from each of our panelists about their organization, and I'll hear from their initial take on the issue. I'll ask some questions and certainly welcome your participation in the conversation. So please get your questions ready, either here or online, and we'll turn to those in just a bit. But I thought that we'd hear from each of the panelists and their perspective first. And Peter Lindstrom, you're on the screen first here. And so I'm going to call upon you first and share your perspective on this and a little bit about your organization and your role with the Metropolitan Council, please. Thank you.
Happy to do so. John, thank you so much. And thank you to the Institute, to Northrop, and to the University Honors Program for being a part of it. I knew when I heard Northrop was going to be involved here, I knew that I was only going to get to the Northrop stage through this and not through my amazing singing voice, or not so amazing singing voice, I will tell you that. So thanks again. I'm originally from Wilmer, Minnesota, which is about 100 miles west of the Twin Cities, and I currently live in Falcon Heights since about the mid-90s or so. And Falcon Heights is a very unique city. It's about 5,000 people, two major institutions in our city. One is the University of Minnesota, the St. Paul campus, and is 100% within Falcon Heights as well. We're also home to another distinction that is quite sad, and that is where Philando Castile was shot and killed by a St. Anthony police officer on July 6, 2016, which is a terrible scar on our city and our state and our nation, quite frankly. As Brianna said, I did serve as an elected official in Falcon Heights for nearly 20 years, 2 terms on the city council and 3 terms as the mayor. And then in 2019, I was appointed by the governor to serve on the Metropolitan Council as the representative for District 10. And that runs from Falcon Heights, Roseville in the south, all the way up through Blaine in the north. The Met Council, just a real quick background, it's the region's planning agency, and it covers a wide spectrum of activities, most well known for operating Metro Transit. And but even there we have the regular routes, the bus routes, light rail transit, bus rapid transit, metro mobility, commuter rail, about 90 million rides or so, give or take, each year. We also operate 9 wastewater treatment plants across the region, 600 miles worth of sewers. We're also heavily involved in affordable housing. We are the metropolitan area's HRA, Housing and Redevelopment Authority. So we have 7,200 federal vouchers across the region. And then last but not least, we are very involved in our parks, for planning for what our parks look like, providing funding for our 56 regional parks across the Twin Cities. I have the greatest day job, so that's kind of my side hustle. I got the greatest day job ever. I work for the clean energy resource teams, and my job is to go out and work with schools and cities and counties and to help them make them as energy efficient as possible and to use renewable energy. So I do a fair amount of traveling across the state during non-COVID times. And John, I'll just kind of wrap up by saying I've been giving this some thought about geography and identity, and the first things that came to mind are certain phrases that evoke images like a West Virginia coal miner, or a Virginia farmer, or a Pennsylvania steel worker, or an iron ranger. And I'll wrap up by saying, most days I get a little down when I read some of the headlines, but I'm cautiously optimistic from most of the time, and I see glimmers of hope across our state, both through my day job on clean energy issues and working on the Met Council, and I think the most important word in the lexicon today is we, the most powerful word in democracy. It's not we the suburban people, or we the suburbs shall overcome, or yes we the suburbs can. It's we the people, we shall overcome. Yes, we can. I'm cautiously optimistic, John, and I look forward to the conversation.
Well, thank you very much. And several aspects of what you talked about, I want to return to when we begin the broader discussion. So thank you for sharing your perspective. I thought I'd turn to Elissa now and get a perspective from up north. So please welcome, and why don't you please share a little bit about yourself and your organization as well.
Thank you, John. I am a pretty type A person, so I'm sharing my screen, the PowerPoint that I have ready.
That's great. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. So I'm the president and CEO of Norspan. Most folks on this probably have never heard of us. We are a private nonprofit fee-based consulting group that was actually established in 1985. We were birthed out of the Arrowhead Regional Development Commission. So like Peter said, that Met Council, this is a similar organization that serves just the 7 counties of the Arrowhead. And so our organization was birthed in the 80s when the Iron Range area and Duluth were really struggling. There were a lot of organizations like ourselves. That's when the Minnesota Initiative Foundations got going, and the Entrepreneur Fund and a few others across the region. We're a small team of 5. And why we're here? We are here to engage and elevate across our region. And then when we get into this, I'll explain a little bit how some of our work is based in communities, but we're also a consulting organization that is fee-based, as I said. Our service area for the programming has these geographic boundaries. So, what does that look like and how does that impact the work we do? We consider Duluth urban and the rest of our area rural, where we are the urban centers of greater Minnesota, not outstate, just so you know. But then, even here in our region, there is that urban rural divide. And the rest of the work we do in our consulting is not geographically bound compared to some of the programming. So just a high level, I'm going to click through some of these fast. So if you read them, great. If you don't, I'll be just chatting about what it says. But we consult in 3 areas: business, organizational, and community development. So we are kind of the arm of greater Minnesota to do that kind of development consulting that doesn't really exist north of the Twin Cities in a way. We also manage and what we say power some community programs. Most of those have 15 to 30 person advisory committees that are made up of geographic territory to serve them. And we power them either with our staff or we hire consultants to do that work. So it's an interesting combination. In that business development, just high level, what we've been doing this last year in COVID, and when this is really impactful to all of our state, urban and rural, we partner a lot with banks, small local banks that don't have SBA staff. So we processed over 150 PPP loans. Some people might be familiar with that, Paycheck Protection Program, over $10 million. And another 730 grants or loans we did third-party verification on for our foundations and other economic development partners across our region to get over $6.5 million out to our small businesses. So it's just, you're going to hear a lot about collaboration, that I think that when we have those lines and barriers, the best thing we can do is try to break them down. From an organizational standpoint, we do a lot of strategic planning. That's probably the easiest thing that people connect to us. We do a lot of facilitation of summits, different types of gatherings. We primarily do that with our communities, EDAs, HRAs, and a lot of nonprofits that maybe couldn't afford to hire one of those big consulting firms that you may have heard of outside of our state, or, you know, Madison or Chicago. We're like the local group. In a community development capacity, we actually sometimes staff groups. So the East Range Joint Powers Board is a combination of 4 communities that come together that utilize our staff power because they get the team of 5 instead of 1. So we provide this really interesting way to look at economic development, community development from that regional standpoint while we're working in these individual communities. From that community programming standpoint, some of these logos are a little fuzzy, sorry about that. We run 4 programs and launching a 5th. And this is where I think it's so interesting to see how that rural urban divide, even in our area, is captured and kind of broken down through programming. So this program is provided in an 8-county area, actually 7 counties of Arrowhead and into Douglas County. So we're bumping into Wisconsin because our port component is such a strong economic driver. This is all about having our commercial and industrial real estate data ready to go for our economic development partners across the whole region. North Force is our region in this state. In this program, 7 counties, the Arrowhead, and 3 in Wisconsin. So we're crossing even those boundaries and barriers. And this is like our region's monster and Indeed. The reason it's different is because there's actually people connecting the individual to the job or the employer to the individual. So it's a really interesting component of our work. Minnesota Opportunity Collaborative is all around opportunity zones. This is the portal for the state. So this is actually a statewide program. However, if you go into it, you'll see most of everything that's participating and listed in there is in our rural communities. So we're bringing like urban education awareness around opportunity zones into that rural community through webinars and different types of trainings. And then everything that's listed on here from a site or a project actually is listed on a national platform. So really connecting our rural communities to national capabilities. I'm going to skip that one. The Upper Minnesota Film Office has been underneath our wing from a grant perspective since the 90s. And they are actually this year birthing themselves into a new 501c3. So just an interesting way. And they were created from the Minnesota Film Office that is obviously done in the cities. The 5th area that we're jumping into that is no surprise to anyone is welcoming community strategies. And if you're familiar with other rural communities, Region 9, which is in the south, Region 5, which is kind of in the central area, have some really strong community programming that's going around welcoming communities. I'm going to talk a little bit about this here in a second. So those important issues, like what's really on people's minds up here, we're in the process of doing what's called the Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy, or affectionately known as the CEDS for people that are in regional development. We're doing 24 Zoom engagements across the region right now to support the CEDS. We've got almost 300 people engaged in that. And these issues were the issues before, but these continue to come up in every single session right now. And what I find so interesting about these issues when we talk about that divide, these are the issues that divide us and bring us together. So housing, probably no surprise to our partners that are in a larger communities. We're, in all of our communities right now, we've got a less than 3%, sometimes 2.1% vacancy rate when it comes to our owner-occupied housing. There can't be built fast enough in our rural communities. We're doing studies on it. We're doing task forces, bringing people together to talk about what it means to have more housing and including more people in your community. Right next to workforce. We don't have enough people for the jobs we have open. So how are we going to be bringing them into our community? Because we aren't birthing them fast enough, I tell you what, in rural Minnesota. And then aging. This should say youth and aging, quite honestly, and related to our housing and workforce development, and so intertwined. How do we continue to utilize our elders, not only from a mentoring or peer capacity, from entrepreneurship to that workforce development, but how are we still welcoming them into our communities, and our youth, K-12, are they feeling welcome? So these are the conversations that are happening that all kind of center around and are funneling into the welcomingness of Northeast Minnesota and that rural urban concept of where people feel welcome, where the perception is or the reality. And I would say, you know, from my experience, our region's behind compared to some of our other regional partners in greater Minnesota. It is all about the chicken or the egg. It's about the horse and the cart. Who's going to jump forward in these super intricate components of community development and connecting across really tough subjects? And if we don't have collaboration, we are pretty much lost. And so that is the key to our work, and understanding, you know, what's happening, where Peter and Shannon are working, and being able to bring those conversations to our community. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And that was quite compelling. Many aspects of what you're working with and what you explained can be good threads for our dialogue going forward. I thought in particular, the fact that within your region, there is an urban and rural divide that exists as well. And it's not, of course, solely defined between the cities and greater Minnesota. But let's turn to the cities and let's hear a little bit from Shannon Smith-Jones from Hope Community. And Shannon, thank you very much for joining us today. And if you want to take a little bit of time and tell us a bit about yourself and your organization and how you see some of these issues.
Most certainly. Thank you, John. And great, Peter and Elissa, you guys have said a lot of great things. Again, my name is Shannon Smith-Jones. I am the executive director at Hope Community. Hope Community is located in South Minneapolis in the Phillips community, which is really considered one of the most diverse areas in the state. Hope Community was founded in 1977. It started out as a shelter and has since evolved into a housing organization that does community building. And we focus a lot of our work on placekeeping, as we call it, or what would be anti-gentrification measures. We have close to 300 units of housing right now. 75% of that is affordable at 50% of the area median income and lower. We have food justice work. So we have 7,500 square feet of community gardens. We do organizing and organizing training. We do organizing through art. So we have murals throughout the Phillips community that involves a deep community engagement process that we do that really helps community be able to see themselves in the communities in which they live. And we have an amazing youth program that actually, if you guys get a chance, look up pop sockets, because our young people are designed a pop socket, those things that go on the back of your phones, and Best Buy is selling them, and our youth created those in our technology center. So we have some really great work here. To tell you a little bit about myself, I am a fourth generation North Minneapolis girl, born and raised. Our family's been here for a really long time, and I still live in North Minneapolis. I have two young men that I have raised, and I have a deep love for community. And so these, the rural urban divide to me is really critical. And I think Elissa mentioned a lot of them, housing, workforce. I think one of the things that we really need to explicitly talk about is racism as well, because I think that plays a really huge role in that, and the disconnect between urban and rural folks. So that's a little bit about me and about Hope Community.
Well, thank you very, very much, Shannon. Appreciate it. Thanks to all of you. And, you know, ideally, and perhaps in the past, there were issues that transcended geographic borders and brought Minnesota together. We're literally at one of them here at Northrop Auditorium and the University of Minnesota, and certainly so many throughout our state still have a sense of pride and sense of place with the state land grant university. But it seems that lately, reflecting the divides in the country and the polarization that exists, including on geographic lines, it often happens over negative incidents, tragedies, or things that divide us quite tragically and quite sadly. And I want to jump into that because all of you are going to have a perspective on it. And Peter, I'll start with you because you directly had to contend with this in terms of the tragic incident with Philando Castile. And of course, we saw in last May, the looting that took place after the tragic killing of George Floyd, involving the Minneapolis police force. And beyond this, of course, being an issue within the city, we see it manifesting itself just this week at the legislature, where, as we all know, there's a roaring and roiling debate over funding for additional security over the upcoming trial of Derek Chauvin. And so, Peter, I'll start with you. If you can just share your firsthand experience of what it's like to deal with this, and then if you'll take that experience and what has or hasn't been learned, with the George Floyd situation and how you think this is playing throughout the state and how you think it might be able to, be more unifying than dividing.
Thank you, John. There's a lot to unpack there. That's for certain. Geez, where to begin? I mentioned a little bit about our community. It's small, 5,000 people, relatively small, at least within the Twin Cities. It's a small community. The biggest issue on July 5th, 2016 was whether or not we should build a sidewalk to our school. That was an important issue. That's an important issue for people that live on Garden Avenue. That is not an issue that makes the headlines of the Star Tribune, much less the New York Times. On July 6th, all of that changed. Philando Castile was shot and killed that evening by a St. Anthony police officer. And our community was thrust into the national spotlight. And the ugly issues of racism became forefront for many of us. I knew, I was mayor at the time. I knew that this was way beyond, way bigger than me. And that we needed to start with conversations. So we pulled together a group of residents, very diverse group of residents, and had a series of conversations about policing and about being a welcoming community. That took a long time. A lot of people wanted us to take immediate action. They wanted us to cut the contract with the St. Anthony Police Department, which ultimately did happen. But it was really fascinating, John, because we ultimately had conversations with our neighbors to neighbors, on way deeper issues than we've ever had before. It was much deeper. You see your neighbor and you talk about the weather, you talk about the Vikings, you talk about the Twins. Now we're talking about racism in not just in the nation, but in our own community and in our own police department, in our own systems. And so I'm very proud of our community. I'm proud of how we came together. I'm proud of the changes that we made. It was heart-wrenching. I don't think we've got it all figured out. I think we did a lot of things right, but I think we stumbled along the way as well. So yeah, it's a huge issue that we just need to keep diving into, and I'm kind of reminded a little bit of that old story that we're all familiar with the starfish. How the starfish, the boy's walking on the beach and there's a bunch of starfish and he throws one and it makes a difference for that starfish, that old story. And I think that's okay, but it has become more and more clear to me that we need to be thinking about not just pulling out one starfish, but like changing the entire neighborhood for the better, and looking at systems as a whole that are creating these problems in the first place, or have created these problems for 400 years, and how we can change as communities, as cities, to be much better than where we are right now.
Well, let's talk about cities and changing and getting better. And Shannon Smith-Jones, as you see this issue, you, of course, I'm sure, followed quite closely the tragedy in Falcon Heights with Philando Castile. And of course, you, as well as the rest of the nation and indeed the world, observed the killing of George Floyd and the aftermath of it. And what's your perspective on this issue, and pursuant to the theme of today, to what degree, especially the aftermath and the months afterwards, do you think this may have exacerbated some of the differences between the cities and the suburbs and exurbs and greater Minnesota?
Exacerbated, that's an interesting word to use. So yes, I've experienced this and was there for all of this. What I would say is racism is always forefront. It's always there. It hasn't just come forefront. I think that with social media and certain things that we're able to see it. And so I think what is happening is the world is having a reckoning with what the Black experience has been, right? Like, this is our life. It is not something that just needs to be talked about. Our men are disappearing. Our men are being murdered. Our husbands, our sons, our brothers, our uncles are being murdered with no accountability. And we're angry about it. And I think what George Floyd did was, that was one instance that you could not argue about, right? Like, you couldn't say this is what he did. You couldn't go back and talk about all of these other things. It was such a clear case that, one, I think it's waking people up, but I think what's happening in this moment in time is there's a reckoning. People are recognizing there's something, and some people are afraid of that. And I think you double down, on sides of like, no, Blue Lives Matter, and you start doubling down on this and these systems. And I think, Peter, you are correct. These systems were never created to work for any brown people. They were not set up that way. And we're still working on systems that were set up to exclude. And so we really need to think deeply around what do we need to do to reconcile the sides of this, and really come together around what it means that you can benefit from something that someone else does not benefit from, and that your actions that could kill one person over here, someone else can walk away with. Like, we need to really figure this out and struggle with this and have these uncomfortable, hard conversations. Otherwise, nothing's gonna move with that. But I think it's deepening down a little bit to your question, but I also think it's pulling back the curtains. We're now being able to see, like, this is an everyday experience. This is not something we've made up for, in our life, existence. Like, we talk about it all the time, and now people are actually believing what we've been saying in community, because now they can see it with their own eyes.
John,
Thank you very much. Yeah, please.
Jump in? I just want to double down on that. Every conversation I would have after that terrible shooting with a Black or brown person, it enlightened me about the Black experience, as Shannon said. Like, people that I wouldn't have known or have known for a long time would share with me how they are regularly pulled over for a broken tail light or just nothing, besides being black or brown. That was not like that happened sometimes in those conversations. That happened all the time. Those conversations happen all the time. So absolutely, we just, as Shannon said, we need to figure this out, and we need to figure it out yesterday.
Thank you very much. And Elissa, of course, this was also an issue that, as I mentioned, was not just statewide and national, but international. But I'm wondering what the perspective was in your area, how it's continued to play out, especially as we see it becoming a divisive dynamic in the state legislative session. And was this reflected in some of the divides that you talked about that actually might be happening between Duluth and the rest of the region?
Absolutely. Not only Duluth and the rest of the region, but in those more rural communities than Duluth, just even within each of those communities, we've got Chisholm and Hibbing right next to each other, Virginia and Eveleth. There's a lot of different views between those. And I really also like how Shannon put it, that was a reckoning. Racism has been here, it is here. And in Northeast Minnesota, it's very prevalent. And I've sat in conversations where people will say, I know I'm racist. And they're working through that now and willing to say that out loud. And when we're having conversations, that welcoming work absolutely has to do with racism. But also even in our own communities, welcoming people that just aren't from here, period. I'm not from here, right? I've been here 10 years and still some people I'll say, yeah, I'm a Duluthian. They're like, where'd you graduate from high school? And I'm like, Brainerd. And they're like, what? I'm not from here yet for some people. But I think what's really interesting in that, how this has the reckoning of it and the willingness to have that conversation has actually broken down some of those divides. We may not see that, people may not see that about us from the legislative perspective. This is my opinion and those who I work with, but here, boots on the ground, doing the work, people are having these conversations and they're more positive than negative, which is exciting. The reason that welcoming strategy is something that's being looked at from a regional perspective is because our community, our region, the 7 counties, is about 8% Black, Indigenous, and people of color. As you probably know, more Indigenous than any other race. And in our school districts, that's double and sometimes triple for our K-12 youth. So our BIPOC populations are here. We want them being, participating and being part of our community. But how welcoming are we even to our K-12, where that population of people is double than the general population? So it's really interesting to be having these conversations about race now when people are willing. And so I just run into it every day where someone who I never would have thought would say in a community meeting, city council, et cetera, that they want to talk about welcoming. While at the same time, while having people of different colors in the room, I'll have someone say, well, what cultures? Do we have different cultures in the room? And so there is that constant struggle in the same room, in the same space in some of our small towns. It doesn't take much of a geography divide to see that conversation happening and the struggle to even recognize different cultures.
If we look at the year 2020, the national election will, of course, be the transcendent story that so many other aspects that we'll talk about today feed into. And we just talked about one difficult one. And of course, the other seminal story of the year, if not the era, is the pandemic. And this seems to have played out differently in different regions with different health and political responses. And so, Shannon, I'll start with you, if that's okay, and just if you'll share your perspective on this issue, how you think it's been responded to by local and state government authorities, and to what degree you see that there might be geographic differences in the response, both in terms of policy, but also politics.
Thank you, John. I think unfortunately the pandemic has turned into a political event, right? And I think that was the first mistake, right? It became partisan. And so I think that's partly why it hit the way it did. But when we talk about the disparities of how it's hitting communities in different ways, we're living in a world that is already steeped in disparity. So with housing, right? We know that housing is a problem. We know that it disproportionately impacts Black and Brown folks more than anyone else, that they're more doubled up, that they have to work more frontline jobs, that they have less access to healthcare. Like all of these things start to build up. And when you have a pandemic that says, I have to go to work no matter what, I'm trying to homeschool my kids, I'm trying to take care of my mother or my aunt, you know, like you're doing all of these things and we're all living in one house, right? And so I think those are the things that double down on it. And I think the politics of it is just shameful. It's just outright shameful that we've allowed politics to corrupt our minds enough to think that we're not going to go about things in a way to keep each other healthy. And that whether you wear a mask or not says who you vote for is ludicrous. And I'm looking forward to a moment when we can pass this time in history and we can be a little more pragmatic about this, because people are losing their families, they're losing loved ones, and one is too many. And this has been a horrible pandemic, and it's impacted many families, urban and rural, right? It's not picking. And I think that's the part that's sad about it, is that it's impacting everyone, and yet we've turned it into a political issue.
Thank you. And Elissa, Shannon is of course quite right that COVID tragically, doesn't choose and doesn't respect geographic lines. And yet the response to this has often been disproportionately different among different geographies, in particular, the response of state legislators as an example, or some communities who have pushed back against mask mandates much more aggressively than some other communities. Share your perspective, if you will, from your part of the state and what you see happening.
From my part of the state, and obviously I'm in this room more than I am out on the road. Normally I'm also on the road about every single day, but I am getting out into the community some, so I'm getting to experience the difference. I think you'll see there's pockets where masks are, no one kind of cares. Absolutely. But there are also pockets where if the community leaders are leading that effort, it's wildly different than those little individual pockets. I would say the majority of the communities that we're working in, be that a 500-person community to 5,000, are following that leadership. And that's not necessarily the political leadership, but those community champions. So just real quick, great story, Cook County, little home of Grand Marais, Minnesota, where there are hundreds of thousands of visitors throughout the summer. That did not stop, that kept on going, but that community and their leadership came together from a hospitality angle and worked so hard to make sure that they still maintained one of the lowest infection rates in the state. And it was pretty amazing, but it took like serious collaboration, right? And community organization and community conversation. And I do think that trickled across the 7 counties.
Thank you very much. And Peter, of course, so unfortunate for so many, but especially up in Falcon Heights, one of the seminal events in the state every year takes place in your backyard. It got canceled for the first time since the polio epidemic in the 1940s. We're talking, of course, about the state fair. And, as a previous elected official, now on the Met Council, what is the role of leadership? To what degree do you see that this has differed geographically and perhaps amplified the divide that exists there? And how going forward do you think is the best way to address this?
Thanks, that's a great question. And first, let me say, just to back up everything, Elissa, I love that you brought up Grand Marais, and that kind of highlights how when we say rural, that's not just this uniform blob of red on a map. outside of the 494, 694 area. There are, you can have places like Grand Marais, which are magical and kind of their own little spot there, as well as our tribal nations. I mean, you're talking politically, those are as rural as you can possibly get, oftentimes, and often very blue areas. To the point at hand, it is extremely unfortunate that this has become incredibly political. And I'll tell you, if I was a candidate, Joe Biden, a year ago, I would have been very nervous, because what brings a people together to rally around their leadership more than a crisis, a terroristic event, a pandemic? And our former president, I think, made it very political, and I think shot himself in the foot in many, on more than one occasion because of that. On the local level, there was, at least here in the suburbs, there was a move to move forward on mask mandates, maybe a little bit earlier than the state level. Several cities imposed a mask mandate, probably March, certainly by April timeframe. And I think I'll just wrap up my portion here by saying one of the things that perhaps this has called out, this pandemic, one thing that perhaps unifies us now a little bit more is the importance of broadband in our state. I think before it was seen as more of a rural issue, and now with parents working from home often, and kids at home, everybody on computers, and that need for really good broadband from border to border is really important.
On that issue, one of the more tweeted and posted pictures we've had in the Star Tribune, it seems, in the last several months, was the photo of the mother and the teenage son sitting in their car in the McDonald's parking lot, trying to pick up on their Wi-Fi to be able to do distance learning. And so you're quite right. And that was not in the remote rural area, part of the state. This is something, as you say, that affects everywhere. And, Peter, you mentioned, and we would be remiss, especially, with the audience here who I certainly welcome their questions, and in fact, would love to turn to them soon. So jump in on the Q&A portion of the discussion today. But, you mentioned that the big blob of red, as you say, that some people perceive, the rural aspects of our community. So we have to address politics, because it's how so much of policy and so much of how we also self-identify, and going to the whole theme of this series here. And, certainly for our younger participants today, it wasn't always like this. The DFL party here, of course, stands for Democratic Farmer Labor Party. And within many of our lifetimes, the farmer vote, the rural vote, was not so monolithically Republican as it seems to be right now. Labor was spread out more throughout the state, and Democrats indeed were spread out more throughout the state. For Republicans, places like Edina, Minnesota used to be among the most Republican portions of the state, if not the nation. And recently a legislative candidate who's a Democrat ran unopposed there. And that shows how significantly shifted that area is. And of course, it's been decades now since a Republican has been represented on the Minneapolis or St. Paul city councils. And so we have, perhaps of all aspects of this division between rural, exurban, suburban, and city, it's playing out politically as much as anything. And so I'd like you to each address this, what you see, and what you think might change this dynamic, so we're not so politically polarized based on geographic lines. And Elissa, I'll start with you, please.
Great, thank you. I think one of the things that I think about, and as a ex-Duluth City Councilor, where we tend to be plugged in the little blue area, it's still very much not a partisan race, even though it is, right, at our city council levels across the state. This was an interesting election in comparison to the last one, in that I can't tell you how many times I drove past Biden-Harris signs in yards that also had Blue Lives Matter signs. It's a really, the dynamic is really interesting where that wasn't there before. And I think that our area has been kind of known for having purple senators in the past with Roger Reiner and a few others, Eric Simonson. And so it's really interesting to see that battle where our area tends to be really, from a full perspective, the full 7 counties, really on that 50-50 line. And when you get into some of those communities, it'll go really far one way or the other. So it was a really interesting year, and it's hard to watch your community struggle that much from a political standpoint. But it is interesting how they choose to then come together around these topics and put that aside. I think that's where I get, my passion from working with our communities. We work a lot with EDAs and city councils and HRAs, and they still want to do the work that isn't political, I guess you'd say, and that is really focused on the community. And so I think that's where people like me in our region really, we try to dig for that, we try to find it, we try to elevate it so that we can better educate those who are getting elected into those positions.
Shannon, how about this from your perspective, and how significant an issue do you think that this is, and does it make it harder to advocate for people in the city of Minneapolis when it indeed is so split geographically in terms of political representation in this state?
Oh, I think I think the divide is extremely difficult. I think Trump made it more difficult. And I say that because my perspective is Trump was, was racist, sexist, and those things created a different thing that wasn't just political. But what I will say is that I believe, and Marguerite made a comment in here that we're talking mostly about a urban perspective versus rural. I can't speak to the rural side, but what I can say is I know housing is an issue, right? I know that's across the board an issue. I know food security is an issue across the board. Peter, I appreciate you bringing up the technology. That is an issue across the board, right? Education is an issue across the board. And so I think what happens is we start looking at our political lens and saying, you somehow can't think or care about the same things that I do, or you want to fund it differently. And I think we need to get out of our ways. Like, it would be nice just to get in a room where no one knows what your political affiliation is and say, well, how do we solve this issue? Because if the least of these are taken care of, then we all are, right? And so I think we all care about many of the same things. I think the struggle is the approach to it. Where should money go, right? Do we give corporate breaks to these banks and these big companies and do that without any question, or do we really support the people that can't eat, right? Like, these are the debates we're having. And I think the how is really getting down to it. But I think if we just got down, we care about the same things, the stuff that we've talked about: safe communities, our families being well, education, housing. These are all things we all care about. And it would be nice if we could get past this moment, but I think it's going to take some healing. And I think we might have to have some healing conversations in the wake of this, because I think people are hurt. It's hurtful when your neighbor supports someone that you feel like doesn't care about your life, right? That's some real deep hurt. And I think we actually need to do some healing after what we've gone through the last few years.
Thank you. And Peter, Shannon, of course, just added to your previous comment about broadband and added education and housing and food security and other issues that can and indeed in past times had a more specific legislative prescription that often the state was able to rally around, sometimes to an extraordinary degree that the governor of Minnesota ended up on the cover of Time magazine because of the success that the state had in expanding educational opportunities is just one example. To what degree does this political polarization on geographic lines keep that kind of progress from happening? How durable do you think these divisions are, and what might get us beyond them?
Well, I think we need a new Minnesota miracle, don't we? Wouldn't it be amazing to be on Time magazine again, holding up a Northern, talking about the Minnesota miracle of one Minnesota, about how we conquered these great divisions.
And just for our younger
these great
our younger participants today, I just thought I'd very quickly jump in, and you of course jump in too, Peter. Former Governor Wendell Anderson in the 1970s, wearing well before Governor Walz did, a classic Minnesota flannel and holding up a Northern with an iconic Time magazine cover, The Good Life in Minnesota. And it was about the Minnesota miracle, which was a way to fund schools that broke down some of the inequities that existed between wealthier communities and the vast majority that struggled with school funding. And they came up with, as you mentioned, the Minnesota miracle, a much better way to fund it. And the educational outcomes in this state greatly improved. So go on, but I just want to give that quick background.
Yeah, absolutely. I was too young to read it at the time, but I know my Minnesota history, and Google it after this is done, and it's a great story. And actually, my father was in the legislature at that time, so was a part of it. As mayor, I love the nonpartisan aspect of this. I never knew how my fellow city council members, if they were Democrat or Republican, I kind of got a sense of what their values were. I could make an educated guess on what their politics were, but we never really talked about that, and I appreciated that. And I think, in one sense, I think that we would be better off as a state if we were not so isolated in our own political echo chambers, that we lived next to people that had more diversity of all stripes, political, youth, race, whatever have you. I do think we might be a little bit better off. So at the same time, I do like, I'll be honest, I like living in a place that reflects my own values. Meaning I like to live in a place where I see those signs that reflect my own political beliefs, where it says Black Lives Matter, or all are welcome here, or my own particular candidate. I like living in a place where I know public schools are supported with referendums. I like living in a place where there are community gardens that I can participate, and where transit is available, things of that nature. Things that I can get it here in the suburbs and perhaps in the two major cities that might be a little bit more challenging in other places.
Well, thank you very much for that. And Brianna, please feel free to jump in with any questions that people may have. I know in the comments section, there's been an understandable desire to talk a little bit more about rural issues, or this from a more rural perspective, and any and all can jump in on that. I'm going to turn to you, Elissa, in terms of what you see from that perspective.
And John,
also, yeah, please.
it's Brianna. Whenever you're ready, we have about 17 questions in the queue. So we have plenty of questions to see us through the rest of our time. So
Fantastic. Brianna, I'm just going to turn to you. Perhaps some of them will include some of these rural issues that we want to address, but Brianna, jump in and please fire away.
excellent. Okay, we'll start with the first question, which was asked near the beginning of today's presentation. There are financially challenged families in rural, urban, and small towns. How do we use smart technology, tourism, and creative transportation to reinvigorate the job market in and between these communities?
Elissa, this sounds like something you work with every day. So why don't you share your perspective, please?
Yeah, we do. I think part of it is, so speaking of broadband, right, getting to that smart technology, those who have broadband that is of a speed where a family of four can actually be using it, they have more access to those. There are many families with access that are still struggling, especially during this COVID time. But we have a lot of families across our region, as we do in other parts of the state, where if you don't have broadband, you're parking in front of the libraries to get access in the evening to submit homework. And so it's almost at a level in some of our communities where I'm not sure they're even, if they're having a financial hard time, they're not thinking about smart technology. They're just trying to figure out how to pay their bills. And that is a reality for a lot of our communities and members. We've done a fair amount of trying to better understand the unemployment rate in our area, and it was close to 30% for a while during COVID. And so that's obviously impacted our families. So I'll tell you that they weren't thinking about, and still aren't, some of them, how to get connected to technology, or how to even consider the tourism aspects. For those who are connected, those, utilizing the tools of North Force and some of those things that we have created in a regional capacity make a huge difference. So it gets to that point where, as a community person who's working in this, that if you have more. If you have nothing, you still have nothing. And I think that's where, that's what it makes me think of when I see those questions in our area, in the rural communities.
Terrific. And of course, Peter and Shannon, you can jump in on anything, but because we got 16 questions backed up, I'm just going to turn to Brianna if you want to go to the next one, and we'll try and direct them among the three of you. So please.
Excellent. Okay. Next question. Organized labor was a great way for people from spread out and diverse communities to come together and share experiences. Has the decline of organized labor contributed to this polarization?
Shannon, if you want to, why don't you see if you want to address that one as well, particularly because it seems that at least the union strongholds are increasingly in the center cities and often increasingly with government employee unions as an example. So what's your perspective, please?
It's interesting that the organized labor, I think part of it is there's a scarcity happening in jobs and some of those things. And I do think organized labor and or unions created a sort of community around coming together around a shared issue. So it gave us space for that. And maybe we haven't found something to replace that. But I think there's other things that we could be doing that aren't necessarily organized labor. And I think there's ways for us to come together around, people come together around sports, around family, around events. You talked about the state fair. I think, and I don't mean to minimize the question at all, but I do think there's different ways for us to come together collectively. And I'm not sure that the laborized union actually did that. I think it was that there were jobs for people to have. And I think with a scarcity model, we start looking at people as if we're going to lose something. And I think we start functioning out of fear versus there's plenty out here.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Brianna. Jump in with the next question, please.
Excellent. Okay, next question is, what role should education play in bridging the urban-rural divide, and in what form?
I'm sure all of you may have opinions on that, but I want to turn to Peter on this one, and perhaps is something that you've contended with as an elected official as well.
Thank you. Actually, what I was thinking about, it was more my day job with clean energy. and thinking about some of the fastest growing jobs in Minnesota right now are in clean energy. There's about 60,000 clean energy jobs across the state. And the fastest growing jobs are those that I think will be more in the rural sector than anywhere else. I'm thinking about wind technician, for example. That's got to be number one, number two, number three for fastest growing jobs. Solar installer, again, one of the top jobs. And I think a lot of these are going to be out in the rural areas, and including the education for those jobs right now are a little bit in the metro, but primarily centered in technical colleges across the state.
I'm going to quickly turn to both Shannon and Elissa, just your quick perspective. To what degree could education be a unifying theme to break down some of these divides? And Shannon, I'll turn to you first, then Elissa.
I would start with history. I don't think we learned the history of this country right. And I think if we understood how this country was truly formed and some of the real stories as it relates to how this country was formed, I think would help. We're not telling our young people truths. And so when they grow up, they're born with or brought up thinking a perspective that doesn't reflect our true history. And I think that could help. I also think education, as people begin to have, if they have the same access to the same quality of education, that also can help bridge the divide.
Parenthetically, Shannon and everyone listening, the Star Tribune editorial pages, which of course is where I work, we had a counterpoint on this issue on Sunday that ended up being not just the most read items on the editorial page, but in the entire paper this last weekend. So this is clearly an issue that many Minnesotans are compelled by and have an opinion about based on the comments and the number of letters that we got. And Elissa, education as a unifying issue, your thoughts, please.
So I'm glad Shannon went right before me, so I could just echo the history component. We have one program I like to lift up, and we've been talking in communities, how do we get this out to our other school districts to really pay attention? The Deer River School District, not sure if you're familiar with where Deer River is, but it is a majority population of Indigenous in K-12. And they're one of the few schools in our state that has full Ojibwe programming and Indigenous programming. And it's just amazing to see how the community has come together around education and how that's broken down the divide between tribal and non-tribal members and created amazing conversation to move that small town further down the breaking down the divide conversation than almost any other one in our whole region.
That's also a great example of how complex some of these small towns are and not so monolithic, once you're inside them. So thanks for sharing that. Next question, please.
Okay, this one may build off of the last one, although it's less education based. How do you help have those healing conversations around these past few years without arousing and exacerbating political frustrations?
Peter, you've had to have a lot of those conversations when you went through the challenges in Falcon Heights there. So why don't you take this one, please?
Happy to do so. So I've mentioned a little bit about the community conversations that we had. So we created this committee of primarily city residents, and their task was to look at policing and how to become a more welcoming community. And they would come up with recommendations on policing. And then we would have a community conversation. So we'd bring in 150 people, 200 people for facilitated conversations by trained facilitators. So number one, I think that was incredibly helpful, mandatory to have trained facilitators to facilitate those conversations in case someone, the question talked about exacerbating divisions. And by having a trained facilitator, you could kind of keep the train on the tracks. So we would come up with policing recommendations, then have a community conversation and run by those draft recommendations past the entire community, bring them back and finalize the recommendations, and then come up with recommendations on how to become a more welcoming community. Again, have another community conversation. What does the community think about these recommendations? Bring it back, explore, research, hone in, and then enact, move forward. That's how we did it in our city.
I'd love to hear from Shannon and Elissa on this as well. This is a very important topic. Elissa, we'll start with you.
Sure. So I am a facilitator. That's part of my job and what I've trained in for years. And so I have some tools and techniques that we use at the beginning of every meeting. Depending on the group, we set those guidelines and rules together, which often really helps people be human, which is what we're asking them to come with, you know, and to create not only a safe space, but what we call is a brave space. You know, safe allows you to come with your full self, brave allows you to share your full self. And those are not easy. We've also worked with the Tools of Civility, which is a project that's come out of some of the community foundations, and utilize the statements that are part of that, which can be really, really helpful. You know, we're still all human and we're going to get hot and cold based on the conversation. But if we can create a shared meaning at the beginning, recognizing we're all here to hold ourselves in check, but also sharing that conversation, I think makes a big difference for the whole rest of however long those people are together over time.
Many may remember who are participating today that our first conversation in this series was with Braver Angels to talk about breaking down red and blue divides. So it's interesting you use that word. Shannon, your thoughts on this, please.
It's interesting, Elissa. I had written down pretty much what you wrote, what you already said, but really grounding rules of what are the rules of what we're going to engage in. How do we breathe? How do we set the tone? How do we set the space correctly and create a collective community rules on how we're going to engage in the space? It does take bravery, but we also have to have a shared understanding of like what's off limits and how we're going to respect each other in the space.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Brianna, next question, please.
Yes. Nationally, 21% of rural residents are Black, Indigenous, and Latinx. Communities of color are driving Minnesota's growth and will continue to do so. Can you say more about anti-racist work and intercultural competence in small towns?
Elissa, you of course work with many small towns in your work, and as you just mentioned with Deer River, talked about the cultural complexity just of that community. Why don't you address this question, please?
Okay, I'll try to distill this down and not take up the next hour. But in Minnesota alone, we have regions that are far more diverse than Northeast Minnesota when you come to that rural aspect. It's usually around workforce development. Mm-hmm. So we found that oftentimes that is a great place to start the conversation. It connects white people to understanding why we want different cultures, why culture is powerful, and then allowing people to talk about the other words and the isms where they can get stuck. And I think that there is such a wide variety that intercultural development concept, like the continuum of IDI. I'm actually an IDI qualified administrator. I think there's 3 of us that do this work north of the Twin Cities. And so part of what we're doing as a team is trying to get more of those people. When you get into your rural communities, from what I've seen and what I experience, the nonprofit organizations and a lot of the government organizations are ahead of our business and economic development teams. And so I think there's a lot of work to do to start bringing those teams to a same place, just even from a literacy, cultural fluency. And that's where you're seeing that work happen. And it's baby steps and it's going to take time, but there are really important, amazing groups that are stepping forward. And as those groups step forward, more people come forward. It takes bravery.
Well, thank you very much for that. Parenthetically, and you mentioned, the different communities. I have a very good friend who grew up on a farm outside of St. James, Minnesota, and you may be familiar with that situation that, like many Minnesota small towns, was really struggling a generation or so ago, and then had a huge influx of people from Central America and Mexico, and who had moved, first generation immigrants, who had come to the city, and he'll say it's the absolute best thing that ever happened to St. James, and in effect completely revitalized it. And you go in the downtown area there, and you just see the vitality that has jumped in there in the last several years. So indeed, it can be an economic lifeline as well, and as well as just a enriching experience for Minnesotans as well. Let's go to the next question, please.
Okay. How do you inform and educate people who don't usually engage or are aware of community organizations, or those who are frustrated with constantly feeling unheard? So yeah, I think it's a great question to think about.
Shannon, you're often trying to engage people, I'm sure, in your work and what you're trying to do in the community. Why don't you field this one, please?
Oh, that was a complex question. So how do we engage people that feel excluded, basically, right? So I think one of the tools that we use here is food, right? Like, we feed folks every time we do something, no matter what it is. We make sure that we're inviting folks into the space. So if we're going to do a training or a listening session, we are going to sit down and we are going to have a meal together. We're going to make sure that there's childcare there. We're going to have translators there. We're going to do those things. We're going to set that. But I also think sometimes it is a matter of like reaching out and door knocking or talking to people, talking to your neighbors and doing that. People feel isolated because people don't reach out oftentimes. And then you create your own walls and your own assumptions behind that. So I would say relationships, it might sound really simple, but a hello, a knock at the door, you want to come out, it's okay to bring your kids, we have food to eat, is just a real level setter. And then how do we have like fun events together that aren't a topic, right? Like we can just come together for something fun, some community gathering. That doesn't mean that we have to discuss anything. And then you start building relationships. So then when it's time to have these deeper conversations about what's community engagement or a topic, it's a lot easier because we've already built a relationship with you.
Thank you very much for that. And just in the interest of time here, we have a few more minutes. I'd love to get to as many questions as possible. So Brianna, please.
Excellent. Okay. Do you think geographic self-sorting is intensifying because people move where others have similar values in politics? Or do people move primarily for other reasons and find their values, politics change to be more aligned with their new neighbors?
Peter, you just spoke a few moments ago about the very human desire that you like to live among people who might share some of your values, or schools, referendums get passed and all of that. And talk broader, if you will, about this in terms of the question at hand of how much of this self-selecting is cultural, and how much might be economic, or what do you think is driving this?
That's a great question. I can tell you, so I opened up by saying I'm originally from Wilmer, which is a rural community 100 miles west of the Twin Cities. I moved to the Twin Cities region, not because of any sort of politics. It was because that's where all my friends were moving to, and that's where I could get a job. So I don't know. I'd be interested to hear what Shannon and Elissa have to say about this as well.
Shannon and Elissa, let's hear from you. Elissa, we'll start with you.
All right, great. I have ideas on this, and I actually think it's both. People do both. And it really depends on, I think, economic situation. Are they moving because they want that job, or are they moving because the economy that they are in allows them to choose? So I think that there's really both. In this area, we're experiencing what the nation might be calling it run to rural. And people are choosing that location a lot more based on where there's fiber and broadband, and where they can do what they want to do outside and feel less, I think, trapped. And also where education is valued. You're seeing people choose communities where they know where their kids have options. Oh gosh.
Where you can have dogs. Yeah.
Dogs.
I would say, I appreciate that. I think people have false housing choices. So I think sometimes people move where they can afford housing. So I think that's a thing. I do think it's a both and. I am seeing people intentionally moving into more diverse communities because they want to have their kids grow in more diverse communities. And I'm also seeing people that are wanting to kind of double down and stay in safe spaces that aren't challenging maybe your worldviews in the same way. So I would agree that I think it's a both and.
Well, terrific. Thank you very much. We have time for one more question. Brianna, please.
Okay, I think this last one comes from one of the students who's attending online. I come from a small rural Minnesotan town that has very different political and ethnic makeup than the cities. I have found that their approach to the pandemic has been much different than I have seen here in the cities. Less willing to wear masks while out and about, etc. How would you suggest approaching conversations with those rural community members who may not have seen and experienced the same things we have here in the cities?
My guess is that word brave that all of you have used is going to come into play here, but why don't each of you just take a quick thought on this and as a way to end this and share your perspective with the student, please. And we'll start with you, Peter.
Well, I would say it starts with the leadership of the community and not just the mayor and the city council, although that's important, but also the business leaders as well, to say, hey, this is, I mean it when I put this sign on the front part of my business. Masks are required here, and I'm the owner of this business, and I'm pleased requesting you to put on a mask, and maybe here is a mask. So it starts there and extends all across the community, wherever the public may be.
Terrific. Elissa, to some degree, that sounds like that's what happened in Grand Marais that you were discussing. And why don't you expound on this a little bit, please?
Yeah, I do think it comes from the community leaders, and it could be coming from the city council or the town board, but also just the community leaders in that, who are the businesses on Main Street, in those small towns where the community is abiding by some of those recommended rules from the state and the federal government. It's because that Main Street, every single business has chosen to put that sign in their window. And there are main streets that are not choosing to do that. And so you see a mix. And I will say that I feel like in the communities where there is a mix, no one's talking about it. You know, and so if you are the one to talk about and bring it up, you might see some change. It's there's such small towns that it only takes a few people on Main Street to kind of plow the route for everyone else to walk. But it does take, those few people that are willing to step up.
Indeed. And Shannon, we'll give you the last word on this, please.
I would agree with both of them. I also would say I don't think we utilize our youth well. I think our youth could truly lead in this way and say this is, if we give them the task, I think they will bring us along. So I would just add that.
Well, that's a great way to end. And indeed, so many of the youth who are our future leaders hopefully are taking part in this panel discussion today. We greatly appreciate your questions. And Peter, Elissa, and Shannon, we greatly appreciate your participation in the conversation as well. Thanks so much for sharing your experience and expertise. So thank you. And thank you all for joining today. And I hope that you rejoin us on March 18th when we continue the conversation. Have a great day.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.